Folks are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to all for our May webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. My name is Kira Clark-Wolf. I'm a postdoctoral associate in ecology at the center, co-hosting this webinar with my colleagues, Imtiaz Rangwala, who's the climate science lead, and Heather Yoakum, who's the social science lead at the center. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the north central United States that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. This is our last webinar for the current session, but we'll be back with a fresh round of speakers in September. We're recording this webinar, and you can find all of our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, participants will be muted, but you'll have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. However, we encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we'll start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order that they're received. We'll end the formal part of this webinar at 12 p.m. Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to stay on to engage in a more informal conversation is encouraged to do so. And now I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today, who we're very lucky to have present in this webinar series. Catherine Jarnovich is a USGS research ecologist in the Fort Collins Research Center. Catherine earned a PhD in ecology from Colorado State University and bachelor's degrees in biology and anthropology from the University of New Mexico. She began working for the USGS in 2000 while working on her doctorate. She gained skills in integrating disparate data sets of species location data and using these to generate spatially explicit models of species occurrence and abundance. Catherine has developed a research program to assist multiple agencies and groups with species distributions, focusing on invasive species. Her current research involves the application of habitat suitability models to answer different applied research and management questions for various species across a range of taxa and spatial scales. She has also been working with spatially explicit state and transition modeling to inform efficient landscape scale invasive plant management. The title of today's webinar is Modeling Invasive Species Considering Climate to Inform Management Activities. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to talk to everybody today, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to start off here. You can get my slides to advance there. So I'm going to talk about the research that I've done related to invasive species. This is a picture of just a few different species that I've worked on over the years, so different taxa, but mostly focusing on plant species, and you'll see some of these appear later during my presentation. So there's a lot of invasive species in the US, and one thing managers need to know before they can do anything about an invasive is knowing where it is. And there's lots of location data out there in different online and government repositories. These include weed mapping data, monitoring plots, museum data, data collected by citizen scientists, but they don't cover the entire landscape. And we know that invasive species are still arriving and spreading, and their distributions often are not stable. So a species arrives in the US somewhere, it establishes, and then spreads across the landscape. And the United States Register for Introduced and Invasive Species includes around 4,000 introduced established vascular plant species. And so that's a lot of species for people to think about and consider. And the graphs that I have here on the right, the one on top is showing over time on the x-axis, the number of first records there on the y axis. And so this is the first record for unique species within the contiguous US. And so you can see that those numbers of first records have increased over time and are still increasing. And then on the bottom, I'm showing the number of non-native plants recorded in national parks, where each line there is a different park. And so the thing to take away from this is that across the US, even within these different parks, more at a landscape scale, the number of non-native plants are increasing. And so people don't look for invasive plants everywhere, and managers need to know where should they be looking for these. And so how do we forecast risk for these invasive species? So a big project that I've been working on for the last few years is the Invasive Species Habitat Tool, or Inhabit. And the idea for this came through work sitting down with people at the National Park Service and talking about what their needs were and what our capabilities were. And we came up with the idea for this tool where we could deliver habitat suitability models. Right now, there's models for 221 non-native plants in there. By the end of the summer, it'll be 259. And the species that are included are selected and requested by managers. And the models are for terrestrial plants for the contiguous US. And so this web tool has been co-produced with management agencies to serve map products, the top screenshot, and then tabular summaries, the bottom, which summarizes those maps across species for a particular management area. So for a management area for a particular species, we provide information on how much of that management unit is expected to be suitable for that species. And then we can also create ranked risk summaries from these, where you could select a unit, and for all species that we've modeled, it will provide that information integrated with where we know occurrences are found, so that people can develop watch lists. So for example, here's looking at counties within the North Central Cask State area. And so for each county in the top left, we're showing the number of species that we've modeled that have predicted suitability. And then below that, we show the number of species with suitability that we don't have records for yet. And one caveat with this is that we're using data that we're able to aggregate from different sources for occurrence. And so if local areas might have information that they're not kind of sharing up, and so that information wouldn't be included in these, but it could still provide a starting place. And then thinking of how to make these even more useful, we developed this concept of species that are at the doorstep. So that's the top right map, showing the number of species with suitability within a county that haven't been recorded in that county, but have been recorded, say, within a 50-mile radius of that county. So those are the species that might not yet be in a location, but could be really soon. And so those could be a set of kind of local early detection species to try to prevent those invasives from establishing there. And then the bottom graph on the right is showing the number of species with suitability recorded in a county that haven't been recorded in this entire 6-state area. And so that's thinking more of what species are problematic elsewhere in the country that we might want to keep out of this kind of larger region. And the data that I've shown so far, the emphasis is on non-native species presence, but what we really care about is where things become abundant. So we know that as the population density of an invasive species increases, that they have a greater impact. And the shape of that relationship might be different, but there is that positive relationship between their abundance and the impact they have on the recipient community. And occurrences may overestimate suitability for abundance. So there may be some species that the environmental characteristics where they occur and where they become abundant are the same, but where species can become abundant may also be a subset of where they occur. And I love using cheatgrass as an example of this because it's a species that causes a lot of problems in the Western US, but it occurs in all 50 states, but we don't really care about where it occurs, say in Pennsylvania, because it doesn't become abundant and cause problems. And we can also think about this more in climate space. So thinking about cheatgrass and another invasive annual grass, red brome, that are both problematic here in the West. We can look at the climate space that they occur in. And on this graph, the dark brown is showing where they can become abundant, so different cover levels, and then the kind of gold dots are more just where they're found present. And so you can see that where they become abundant is a subset of where they could occur, and also the climate space where cheatgrass becomes abundant is different from the climate space where red brome becomes abundant. So how can we incorporate this information into Inhabit? So again, we're using aggregated occurrence data to make these models because we're making them at a 90-meter resolution across the contiguous US. And abundance data is really messy. So I have a word cloud down at the bottom showing the values from different fields that in some way capture how abundant species are. And so they can be anywhere from a range of numeric values to just textual information. So a lot of the abundance information is more qualitative. And so what we ended up doing is we have these models that use all known occurrences. So a model of where things are found occurrence. Then we use a subset of those, saying where they could become abundant. So using any location that has a value that we could take to mean to be that there's greater than 5% cover. And so we had 217 species with data available for that. And then we also created a third set of models to predict where there's suitability for high abundance using any location where there was greater than 25% cover, and that was for 189 species. And so we have that data. We have a suite of environmental data sets or data that we've put together for the contiguous US that includes 53 different variables, including solar insolation, looking at temperature, topography, atmospheric water, biotic interactions, disturbance, landscape water, and substrate. And all the models that we're creating, we're selecting the predictors that go into each species model based on what we know about the species. So an invasive annual grass in the Western US would probably include a different suite of temperature variables, say, than a tree species in the Eastern US. And just thinking about how many species do we model? So I said by the end of the summer, we'll have 259 species in there, but I also mentioned at the beginning of my talk that there's around 4,000 non-native vascular plant species within the US. And so how do we get down to that number of 259, and is that enough species? And so we can start out with that total number of almost 4,000 species, reduce that to species that are terrestrial, because that's what we're including in Inhabit, and then we can look at different information on the number of records that are available. And when we kind of get down to the bottom where we say, how many of those 4,000 species have at least 50 records where they have at least 25% cover, and that is about half of the species, or 2 times as many species as we have in Inhabit. So we're approaching capturing kind of those most abundant and therefore most impactful species across the country. And so by the end of the summer, we'll have these 259 models up there that will also include maps for suitability for abundance as well as occurrence, the continuous maps, as well as kind of integrated maps here, showing where there's suitability just for occurrence, where there's suitability for abundance, and where there's suitability for high abundance. So one thing that we did with the 221 species models that we have in Inhabit right now was an analysis of environmental predictors and what predictors seem to really be driving these models and which seem to be most important. And the top performing individual predictors across all these species were human modification, so an index of where humans are modifying the landscape, so getting at disturbance, and minimum winter temperature. And then in the most influential predictor groups, so those groupings of predictors that I showed on the figure earlier, those include disturbance, temperature, and atmospheric water. So there's a lot of climate predictors here that seem to be important, and we've had lots of people ask us about making future climate suitability predictions for these species. But we've also thought a lot about what the limits are of forecasting, because these models that we're creating are correlative in nature. So it's correlations between where a species is found and environmental characteristics. And we don't necessarily know that those particular environmental characteristics that we're including in the models are what is truly limiting the species. So we did an analysis led by Helen Sofer that was published in 2018, looking at breeding bird survey data, where we trained models using data from the 1970s and tested them on data from the 2010s. And we used climate and habitat predictors within these models. And all the models seem to perform pretty well, looking at the area under the curve assessment metric. They all had pretty high metrics, so we would assume that these models are pretty good. But when we look at the change in range size, we had observed range change between that 1970 and 2010 time period. And then we had the predicted range change from the suitability models that we fit, and there wasn't a great correlation. And then when we went a step further and we ranked species based on their observed range change and the predicted range change, it was more like we just threw paint at the wall. And so there really isn't a relationship there. And looking in this a little more deeply, we could look at the observed gains, losses, where a species always occurred, where it never occurred, with the predicted. And what we found was that we did a really good job at capturing where species never occurred in the two time periods, and a really good job at capturing where they always occurred, but we didn't do very good at capturing where they either gained habitat or they lost habitat, which is what we really care about when we're thinking about climate change impacts. And others have found the same thing. So there was a paper that just came out within the last month that had similar conclusions to what we found with the breeding bird data. And I really like this figure that I'm showing here from a paper by Dove Sachs and others from 2013 in Tree that shows the locations for a shrub species in the eastern US, and then those same locations in climate space, where the red is showing the native range, the yellow is where the species was naturalized or inventive, and the blue is where the species is grown in a botanic garden or is commercially sold, so places that it can survive at least somewhat. And so what we can see here is that the climate space, looking beyond the native range, is much larger where this species can survive. And so there's probably other factors that are limiting what the native range was beyond climate. And so what can we do thinking about this? So I'm going to give a really quick example thinking about bufflegrass in Saguaro National Park, and then I'm going to revisit the species again in a little bit. But this is a African perennial bunchgrass that's globally invasive and potentially alters the fire regime. And so thinking of the climate context and changing suitability, what we did with this species is we had these species distribution models that we were able to create. And then we had response curves shown here, where the x-axis is the values for the different climate predictors, and the y-axis is the relative probability for that bufflegrass occurring on the landscape. And so on these response curves, we were able to overlay kind of the range of conditions found within the park currently and in the future. So the solid lines are current conditions, the dotted lines are future conditions, and there's a couple different colors because there's a couple different units of the park. But just looking at this, it looks like that the suitability for buffalo grass within the park seems like it's probably going to be increasing with changing climate. Some other work that we've done was taking the Inhabit methodology and using that to look at how invasive species might be shifting their ranges. And so this is work we did with, led by Annette Evans at the Northeast Cask. And what I'm showing here are results for species that are found in the eastern US. We're also doing this for species in the western US, but I don't have those results yet to show. But what we're looking at here is in the graph on the map on the right. The first panel is the number of species with predicted suitability with current conditions. Whoops. And the one on the panel B is with future conditions. And so you can see that there's increasing suitability for species in the northeastern US with changing climate. And we also looked at shifts in predicted range centroids, where the dot is the current centroid of ranges, and then the arrow shows the shift with a 2-degree increase in Celsius. And so most species in the eastern US are seem to be shifting their range towards the northeast. And so the northeast may have more problems with invasive species in the future. And the western results will be coming soon. Another thing we've been asked about with our Inhabit modeling is what about aquatic invasive species? And so we have a project now where we're applying that same modeling framework to aquatic species, but using predictor layers for aquatic environments, including climate. And this project will have a future climate component, and I don't have maps of those yet. If this talk was next week, I probably would. But for this, we're fitting models for lakes, and then we're also fitting models for streams, having different sets of predictors for those. And then we're applying those to future climate and land use to look at how the habitat suitability for these aquatic invasive species might change over time. And then I'm going to give another example that's not related to plants, looking at implications for invasion threat from climate change with tegu lizards, working with some herpetologists at my science center. And so what this work is doing is I led a paper in 2018 working with a lot of herpetologists predicting the habitat suitability for tegu lizards. And since that time, there have been a lot of studies looking at thermal tolerances of tegu lizards, looking at their ability to overwinter in some locations, and a lot more extended range. And so we modeled 3 different tegu lizards that appear to occupy distinct geographic and climatic niches in their native range in South America. And we had 4 different climatic variables that the herpetologists thought were really important for what is known about tegu lizard species. And then we were able to apply those models to current climate for the US, to a 2-degree Celsius warming scenario, and to a 4-degree Celsius warming scenario to kind of look at how the habitat suitability might change over time. And the black and white tegu lizard is the one that's most established in the US. And so here, the gray dots are areas that they've been observed, although all of those aren't necessarily established populations yet. And the black dot in Alabama is where the overwintering study occurred, where they were able to survive. And there's a good picture showing the cages they were kept in with snow on the ground around them, so they could survive colder temperatures than people may have previously thought. And so just keeping an eye on the red circle there, you can see that there's predicted increasing suitability with changing climate in those areas where tegus have been observed. And these species are really common in the pet trade. And so it's important to note that the areas that were predicted suitable from the previous models are indeed suitable. And we're considering these 3 species together for risk assessment because there's climatic distinctions between the species, and we're not sure if that's a true physiological difference or if that's coming from competitive exclusion. And the black and white tegu has the ability to thermoregulate, which likely facilitates its advance northward. And since that original suitability manuscript was published, some Southeast states have used that to help justify passing regulations for banning the black and white tegus. And so the climate change scenarios showing an increase in areas of risk might be important in informing future regulation decisions to try to prevent these species from establishing in other parts of the country. And now switching back to thinking about bufflegrass that I mentioned earlier. We've done some work with state and transition simulation modeling with these, and those types of models can be really useful in answering questions like how big is the problem from the invasive? What would it take to control the invasive species? And how best can we allocate limited resources on the landscape to control a species? And so this type of model, we have this box and arrow diagram where the boxes are different states of the landscape. And so with this one for buffgrass, we had areas that were uninvaded, seed bank, and then different levels of cover. And then top to bottom, we had whether or not the species had been detected on the landscape, because you have to know where the species is before you can go out and do treatments for it. And then there's arrows between the different boxes for how a species can move. So the blue arrows indicate increasing bufflegrass cover, so it's spreading and filling in over time. The yellow arrows indicate whether or not the species has been detected through people going out and looking for it, and the orange ones are treatments for controlling bufflegrass. And so we can use this model to kind of simulate through time how bufflegrass might spread over the landscape and how treatments might affect how much bufflegrass there is on the landscape. And so here are some results from previous work looking at potential fire regime alterations in the Santa Catalina Mountains around Tucson. And here we ran simulations including bufflegrass on the landscape and not including bufflegrass on the landscape, so with and without bufflegrass, and looked at the cumulative area burned, and then the amount of area that was burned at lower elevations, which gets more towards that urban interface. And so through these simulations, we saw that with bufflegrass, we have more area being burned and more area being burned at lower elevations. And those lower elevations are also the desert ecosystem where that's not fire adapted. And so that can have more impact on the native vegetation. And other things we can look at is, as I said earlier, different potential treatments. And so we worked with the Park Service at Saguaro National Park to come up with kind of alternative management scenarios that they were considering implementing within the park. And then we could run the simulation for a 30-year time period and look at how much money they would have spent over time in relation to how much of the park is predicted to be invaded at the end of that simulation, and can look at what different treatment types might be most effective in regards to cost and reducing the invasion. And so with those simulations, the establishment of bufflegrass on the landscape was driven by predictions of underlying suitability, which in those models was constant through time, but we knew, as I showed earlier, that the climate is changing there, and you could have increasing suitability for bufflegrass. And so we started developing in partnership with Apex RMS, who's the developer of the state and transition simulation software we're using, and some Brian Miller at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center and others, this package called Wisdom, the workbench for integrated species distribution modeling, to fit habitat suitability models and allow those to interact with the state and transition simulation model so that you can have feedback at time steps between those. And so we have a beta version of this software developed at this point and have been looking at implementing this where you have the interaction. And so here we've refit the habitat suitability models for bufflegrass within the Wisdom framework. And the key thing to note here is the blue color in the area on the eastern part of the map is the higher elevation of Saguaro National Park. And each one of these maps is a different climate average over a 30-year time period, incrementing every 5 years. And so the top left image is with current climate conditions, and the bottom right is climate conditions in the future. And so you see that there's increasing suitability. That area of blue where it's not really suitable for bufflegrass is increasing over time. And so we can have that feed into these simulation models and look at how that might be affecting them. So what I'm showing here is on the y-axis, we have the area invaded. Along the x-axis is time. And then we ran the same simulations that we'd previously run, looking at different management options. And so the purple line and the red line are paired, and the green and the blue line are paired, having static climate and allowing climate to change over time. And we can see that allowing climate to change, we're ending up with more invaded area at the end of the time. And so this is new avenue of research that we're just looking at right now to see how climate change might affect the management decisions that we might make based on these simulations. Another question that we get from managers is how do we prioritize spatially where we might want to conduct management activities for invasive species. So some work that we did led by Janet Pervet was looking at the post-fire non-native plant abundance in the Western US. And so for this study, we aggregated over 26,000 vegetation plots that had been collected across the West, and then obtained information on whether or not those plots had burned prior to sampling. And what we found was that short-lived forbs and seethy grasses had significantly higher cover after a fire occurred. So within those plots that had burned versus the plots that hadn't burned. And then we also developed models to predict the post-fire cover for these species groups. And climate variables were the most important in predicting their post-fire cover. And so here I'm showing maps of those predicted post-fire cover for non-native species. The maps on the left are for the grasses. The ones on the right are for the forbs. And then the top maps are the current predicted post-fire non-native cover. And the ones on the bottom show the change in invasion risk in the future to mid-century. And so the areas that are in red on those maps have higher risk with changing climate for more cover of non-natives after a fire occurs. Another tool that we've been working on developing in partnership with the same people at the National Park Service that helped us start Inhabit is a site prioritization tool. And the idea behind this is that a manager at a local level would have all these different layers that we've pulled together that might be related to either risk of invasion or what might make a site a higher priority for controlling invasive species, such as a high number of imperiled species or cultural resources that they want to protect. And that we'd have different layers related to these factors that then the kind of local manager could use their local knowledge and expertise to put together to come up with a user-specific site prioritization map that includes the things that they're most concerned about. And so the layers that we put together for this include layers related to human impact and disturbance. So how remote is a location, thinking of travel times for people from population centers to different locations on the landscape, landscape condition, burn frequency, looking at different types of disturbance from land trender using Landsat imagery, looking at non-native species richness of different taxonomic groups. And then another set of layers that people were interested in having us include was projected magnitude of change in climate. So for example, for mean annual temperature, what's the predicted change between current conditions and future climate conditions. And then again, high priority resources that could be imperiled species richness, and then other user supplied layers that could be things like cultural resources. And the idea is we have this alpha tool put together where a user would select the factors that they were interested in, and those could be would be added together to kind of come up with a composite risk map of where they might want to prioritize resources. And finally, one more thing I want to talk about is a lot of what I've talked about so far has been looking into the future and trying to predict where species might be. But managers are also interested in knowing where species are now on the landscape. And so here's an example of a project that we did in a national forest area that burned in southeastern Wyoming. And so here I'm showing a picture of that landscape, and you can see the red areas on the hillsides, and that is patches of cheatgrass after the fire. And so the managers wanted a map of where cheatgrass was on the landscape. So we used Landsat imagery and different derivatives of that to put into model to predict the probability of cheatgrass on the landscape, that the Forest Service then was able to use that model to obtain treatment funding and then to kind of guide aerial application. It seemed to work pretty well based on these pictures where we have a pre-treatment picture on top and a post-treatment on the bottom, where after cheatgrass, after treatment, the cheatgrass wasn't able to germinate and allowed the native vegetation to recover. But they wanted to go back and kind of update the model with more current imagery. And when we tried to do that, it didn't work well applying that same model that we'd previously developed to imagery from future years, or doing the same thing, trying to apply that model that we'd fit for this one specific site to a different location, mostly due to the fact that what the model is picking up on is the phenology of the species. So cheatgrass was really distinctive in the photo I showed because it had senesced and the native vegetation hadn't yet. So you could see it on the landscape. But the timing of that is very related to weather and climate, which can be variable over space and time. And so been working with Janet Privé to develop phenology forecasting tools for management and detection of invasive grasses. And so again, plant phenology is highly variable and it's influenced by temperature, elevation, and topography. And can vary, so it's going to vary spatially and can also vary from year to year. And so we developed predictive mechanistic phenological models to improve detection of grasses. And then these phenology models can also help managers address when and where to focus management efforts. So thinking of timing of grazing or timing of applications of herbicides, those are dependent on specific phenological stages. And so being able to predict those is very helpful. And so I'm showing maps here based on those phenology models, showing timing of flowering and timing of senescence for cheatgrass and red brome. And the red brome phenology forecasts have been integrated into the National Phenology Network's Pheno Forecast or tool. And then thinking back to the problem that we had with the Forest Service is that now we're using these phenology prediction maps to select the date of imagery that's being used on a pixel by pixel basis. And so a pixel on a south-facing slope may use an image that might be 2 weeks earlier than a pixel on a north-facing slope, because the south-facing slope is going to have earlier phenological stages than the north-facing slope, just due to the temperature differences between those. And so we're able to use sentinel imagery selected during predicted peak greenness and senescent states on a pixel basis to detect cheatgrass. And so we're working on scaling this up to a larger area now and doing the same thing for a wider number of species. And the other thing that's pretty exciting about this is that there is a wealth of plot data across the Western US. And we can use all of those, the data from all of those plots as testing data to kind of validate these models, because we're not including any of that within the development of the model itself. And so with that, that's kind of an overview of the different work related to predicting invasive species distributions to inform management activities that we've been doing. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Round of applause. Yeah, that was great. We had a couple of questions in the chat. We'll also allow folks to unmute to kind of jump in with questions, but let's start with those on the chat. And wow, you are perfectly on time. It's exactly 11:45, so we've got about 15 minutes, which is perfect. So the first question from the chat was, any timeline for the release of Aqua Inhabit web tool for AIS?
Hopefully, we hope to have it up by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. So hopefully.
Oh. Relatively short timeline. That's great. Cool. Next question was, I noticed that tree cover was your only biotic interaction predictor for Inhabit. I was wondering to what extent biotic resistance might matter on a landscape scale for invasibility and if that could or should be modeled.
I think it could definitely influence where species are found. But I think having a layer of that across the entire country, and that would be pertinent for all of the different species is tricky to come up with. So I think if you have plot level data, it's easy to look at that, or maybe even a smaller landscape when you're looking at a single species. But with the scale of what we're doing, we haven't really been able to come up with a lot of other biotic interaction type predictors that we could include. But if people have thoughts about that, I'd love to hear that.
Cool. And then, yeah, the last question was, what treatment did you use on the cheatgrass in Wyoming?
I think it was Mazepec. Let me go back. I think I had it on the slide. Yes. So the Forest Service was using Mazepec via helicopter spraying.
Robert Taylor wants to know, with respect to modeling distribution and abundance of invasive plant species in the Western US, is there one key data set that would increase the accuracy of predictions that isn't available or doesn't exist?
I think having more, so right now, the models that we're making are what we're calling thresholded abundance, because as I explained, we're using like any occurrence that might have 5% cover or greater. And that's because there's not enough, we can't make a true abundance model because we don't have enough true abundance data for all these species. And so that would really be ideal if we had more plot level abundance information across the landscape. And there are some great data sets like the BLM assessment inventory and monitoring plots, they're AIM plots. There's over 10,000 of those across the Western US on BLM lands, but even looking within them, I think despite the fact that a lot of the invasive species are abundant, when you're looking at a landscape, most species are relatively rare. And so there's just, even within that data set for a lot of these invasive species, there's not enough abundance data from those statistically collected plots to be able to fit an abundance model, unless you're talking about something like cheatgrass.
Quick follow-up on that, just from me, you had shown a map with like thousands and thousands of vegetation plot data to look at post-fire non-native abundance. What was the data set that pulled from? Was that the BLM?
It was all different. So it was a huge effort to aggregate different plot data sets. And so there were several people that were willing to share plot data sets that they had that weren't publicly available. And so that is potentially another source for the future of more data that could go into these models.
Another question from the chat. Anyone working to extend any of this work to Conus? I assume that means outside Conus.
Yes. We've been partnering with some people in Hawaii to think about potentially whether or not the models we've hit here could be transferred to island territories. And one other area of modeling that we've been working on that I didn't mention is for species that aren't yet well established within the US or species within trade that have been identified as potentially high risk future invaders. We're going to be fitting models using global predictors and data from around other parts of the world to fit habitat suitability models. And so those would potentially cover, or they will cover Alaska. But the question with some of the island nations is that like global predictors don't do very well there because they're too coarse and they don't pick up the a lot of the factors influencing, say, climate within the island. And so, yeah, that is something we're looking at, but haven't gotten there yet.
Let's see. Reminder that anyone is welcome to unmute and turn on video for additional questions. We have plenty of time left here. Or keep dropping them in the chat, that's fine too. Go ahead, Megan.
Thanks. Hi, Catherine. It was a really great presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was fun to see a broader range of all of your work. I am curious of what your thoughts are kind of what do you think are the important research directions to kind of get at that inability to do the short-term loss and gains of species shifting? How do we get at that to be better at kind of predicting those losses and gains?
I'm hoping that, so a lot of those studies have been done creating models for lots of species at once and using kind of the same set of predictors for the species. And even the one that I partnered with Annette Evans at the Northeast Cask for, it was kind of the same set of climate predictors that we used. And so I don't know if you have better information about what is truly limiting a species, somewhat like we did with the tegu lizards, then if you're projecting in time, maybe you're better able to capture those changes because you're really including the factors that are controlling the species distribution rather than what might be just correlated with the species distribution. But that is it's a lot more effort to be able to create that really specific species model where you've done the studies on the individual species and you really know what's controlling its distribution.
I probably have a question there. Catherine, you showed that winter temperature was one of the top predictor. And I'm guessing interested in what your sense is, why it was showing up as a top predictor. Also, if you have considered, elevated CO2 effects in these simulations, and if you have thoughts around that.
I'll answer the second question first because that's a really easy one. We have not considered elevated CO2 effects, although that seems like that could be could be important to consider, especially in the simulation modeling and thinking how species might spread. Related to minimum temperature, I know that's one. So I said we selected species or selected predictors based on a species by species basis, and that's one that we've typically tended to include. But I think just thinking of range limits of plants, winter temperature often is one of what we know is restricting them, and that they can't live in areas that are too cold. And then I think thinking at the opposite end, when winter temperature is often correlated with maximum temperature, and so we don't end up using those same predictors in the model, but it could be that places are too hot for the plant species too, and there's just that correlation between those.
Another question from the chat. on that question of what controls distribution, do you have a sense of where non-native plants in the continental US are currently distributed within their full climate space, e.g. closer to the extremes or more in the middle on average?
Open the chat and look at that.
So yeah, I guess like if non-native plants are not filling their full sort of range of habitat suitability, are they kind of in the middle in terms of climate space, or are like more towards the edges? Do we have any idea?
I don't know if we have an idea, and especially from the models that we're creating that are potential habitat suitability. Because some of that's going to be dependent on maybe where they've been introduced and where they've initially established and where that falls within the range. And I don't know if we have a good feel for that, but it's definitely something that would be interesting to look at.
This is kind of a much more kind of detailed question, but you had at one point up graphs of climate of cheatgrass and red brome kind of in their climate space with abundance and occurrence both shown. And for cheatgrass, there was kind of a big cluster of areas with high abundance kind of in the lower part. And then there were some areas of high abundance kind of a little bit further out in climate space. I'm wondering if you know kind of off the top of your head where those kind of distributed areas of higher abundance for cheatgrass, or what's driving that?
Like geographically, where those areas are? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, just why those select areas have higher abundance compared to.
I mean, I think like cheatgrass, most of those higher abundance areas were in the Great Basin area, and it doesn't seem like cheatgrass does as well with hotter temperatures. Whereas red brome seems to do better in more of the southwest in those hotter areas, and it can occur maybe farther north, but it doesn't do as well as cheatgrass. And I don't know if there's some competition going on there between the two of them, because they can definitely occur in those other places, but the areas of abundance definitely seem to be more geographically focused like that between the Great Basin and maybe the Mojave area.
All right, we're right up on the hour here. If anyone had a last question, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll stop the recording and we'll shift over to more informal conversation. All right, well, thank you again, Catherine. And yeah, we'll stay on for a few more minutes for anyone who wants to stick around. But that was a great talk. Really appreciate it. And thanks all for joining.